47th floor of Manhattan's gleaming Essex Tower housed Blake Thompson's empire. The conference room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooked a city that seemed miniature from such heights. 10 of New York's most influential investors sat around a polished mahogany table, their attention fixed on Blake's commanding presence. If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. Gentlemen, while our competitors worry about market volatility, we've increased our portfolio by 42% this quarter alone. Blake announced, his custom-made Italian suit matching his perfectly practiced smile. His presentation showed aggressive acquisition graphs, each one representing another company he'd dismantled for profit. Thomas Chen, a veteran hedge fund manager, raised his hand. Blake, there's concern about the social impact of these hostile takeovers. The press is the press, Blake interrupted, can write whatever they want from their dying industry. He clicked to the next slide, displaying profit margins that made several board members lean forward. We're not in the business of saving jobs. We're in the business of creating value for our shareholders. The meeting concluded with unanimous approval for his next acquisition target. As the investors filed out, Blake caught his reflection in the window. At 38, he remained one of the youngest financial powerhouses in New York, and he knew it. His dark hair showed no signs of graying, and regular sessions with his personal trainer kept him looking like the magazine covers he frequently graced. Later that evening, at the Metropolitan Club, Blake sat with 3 of his closest associates. If anyone in his circle could be called close. The exclusive bars, dark wood panels, and leather chairs reeked of old money, though Blake preferred to think of it as the smell of success. Another hostile takeover. James Peterson swirled his 20-year-old scotch. The media's already calling you the corporate cannibal. Blake laughed, the alcohol warming his usual calculated demeanor. They're just bitter because they can't afford to eat at places like this anymore. Speaking of eating, Michael Roberts chimed in. My wife's charity is hosting another gala for the homeless next month. You should come, Blake. Might help your image. The homeless. Blake scoffed. They're just people who made poor life choices. Anyone can make it in this city if they actually try. Easy to say from your penthouse, David Wilson challenged, unusual boldness in his voice after his 4th drink. Blake's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being questioned, even in jest. You think I'm out of touch? I understand people better than anyone. Hell, I bet I could take any homeless person off the street and turn them into a success story. The table grew quiet. Blake, sensing an opportunity, pressed on. In fact, I'll prove it. I'll marry the first homeless woman I meet. 6 months from today, she'll be the toast of New York society. You're drunk, James said. But Blake was already pulling out his phone. Let's make it official. $1 million says I do it. Each of you puts in $1 million too. If I succeed, I get your money. If I fail, you split mine. The other men exchanged glances. They knew Blake never backed down from a bet. But this was extreme, even for him. You're serious? David asked. Dead serious. We'll draw up the contracts tomorrow. First thing in the morning, I'm going homeless shopping. The next morning, despite a slight hangover, Blake stood in his walk-in closet, selecting what to wear for his unusual mission. He chose a cashmere coat that costs more than most people's monthly rent, reasoning that he should look successful even while slumming it. His driver, Martinez, raised an eyebrow when Blake instructed him to tour the city's homeless hotspots. They drove past soup kitchens and shelters. Blake studying the people outside like he studied market trends, calculating, cold, looking for the best investment opportunity. Sir Martinez spoke up after their 3rd hour. Maybe we should try another neighborhood. Blake barely heard him. His mind was already working on how he'd present this to the media. Financial titan saves homeless woman. He could see the headlines now. The perfect PR move to counter his ruthless reputation. Little did he know, his perfectly calculated plan was about to encounter a variable he couldn't control. The St. Mary's winter shelter stood in stark contrast to Blake's usual haunts. The brick building's paint peeled from decades of neglect, and a line of people wrapped around the corner, their breath visible in the cold January air. Blake stepped out of his Mercedes, ignoring Martinez's concerned look. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The smell of industrial cleaner mixed with body odor made him fight the urge to cover his nose with his cashmere scarf. That's when he saw her. Sarah moved through the crowd with purpose, distributing blankets and organizing volunteers with natural authority. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and despite wearing second-hand clothes, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. Blake noticed her stopping to comfort an elderly man, speaking to him with a kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be faked. "We need more soup at Station 3, she called out, her voice clear and commanding. Volunteers responded immediately to her directions, moving with the efficiency of a well-run operation. Blake watched, fascinated. She didn't fit his preconceptions of a homeless person. Her eyes were sharp, alert, and she managed the chaos of the shelter like an executive. "Excuse me," he said, approaching her with his practiced charm. "I couldn't help but notice how well you run things here." Sarah turned, sizing him up with a single glance. "We're always looking for volunteers, Mr. Thompson." Blake Thompson. He waited for recognition to flash across her face, but none came. "I was hoping we might talk somewhere more private." "I'm busy," she replied, moving past him to help an elderly woman with her tray. Blake followed, undeterred. 5 minutes. "That's all I ask." Sarah sighed, handed her clipboard to another volunteer, and led Blake to a small office off the main room. The space was cramped, with filing cabinets lining the walls and a desk covered in donation forms. 3 minutes, she said, crossing her arms. Blake decided to be direct. "I want to marry you." Sarah's laugh was sharp and incredulous. "Is this some kind of joke? I'm completely serious." He pulled out his phone, showing her his Forbes profile. "I'm offering you a way out of this life. Marriage, financial security, a complete transformation. And why would a billionaire want to marry a homeless woman?" Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Blake had prepared for this question. "Let's call it a social experiment. I believe anyone can succeed with the right opportunities. I'm offering you that opportunity." Sarah studied him silently, and for a moment, Blake thought he saw something flash behind her eyes. Recognition, anger, or perhaps both. But it disappeared so quickly, he convinced himself he'd imagined it. "And if I say yes?" she asked carefully. "You'll have your own wing in my penthouse by tonight. New wardrobe, personal stylist, everything you need to enter my world." Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the line of people still waiting in the cold. "These people are my family," she said quietly. "You can help them better with resources than without," Blake countered. Another long moment passed. Sarah turned back to him, her face unreadable. "Yes." Blake blinked, surprised by her quick decision. "Yes, isn't that what you wanted to hear?" There was an edge to her voice that he couldn't quite place. The next few days passed in a whirlwind. Blake installed Sarah in his penthouse's guest wing, arranged for a team of stylists and etiquette coaches, and began the process of transforming her into someone his social circle would accept. Sarah proved to be an unusually quick study. She absorbed information about wine pairings and social protocols with remarkable ease, though she occasionally let slip sophisticated observations that made Blake wonder about her past. "Your collection of Bordeaux is impressive," she commented during dinner one evening, "though I prefer the 82 Latour to the 86. Blake nearly choked on his wine. "You know your vintages." Sarah's face remained neutral. "One picks things up here and there." As the days turned into weeks, Blake found himself spending more time with Sarah than the bet required. She challenged his views, questioned his business decisions, and showed a depth of understanding about finance that both intrigued and unsettled him. But beneath their growing connection, neither could ignore the artificiality of their arrangement. Sarah maintained a careful distance, and Blake caught her sometimes, late at night, staring out at the city with an expression he couldn't read. What Blake didn't know was that every night, after he went to sleep, Sarah sat in her room with a small notebook, meticulously documenting everything she learned about his business operations, his weaknesses, and his vulnerabilities. The transformation wasn't just one-sided. While Blake thought he was molding Sarah into his world, she was quietly preparing for something entirely different. Despite her new address on Park Avenue, Sarah continued visiting St. Mary's shelter every Tuesday and Thursday. Blake initially objected, concerned about appearances, but Sarah remained firm. "It's non-negotiable," she had said, with a finality that surprised him. On this particular Thursday, Sarah sat with Maria, a former school teacher who'd lost everything to medical bills. They shared coffee from paper cups, while Maria showed Sarah pictures of her grandchildren on a worn smartphone. "Tommy's starting college next fall," Maria beamed. "His mother, my Jessica, she's working 3 jobs to make it happen." Sarah listened intently, her designer clothes incongruous against the shelter's metal folding chairs. "Education changes everything," she replied, her mind briefly flickering to her own MBA from Wharton, a detail carefully omitted from her conversations with Blake. Across the room, Jerome, a veteran who'd been living in the shelter for 6 months, approached their table. "Miss Sarah, got a minute? Some suits are here about closing the shelter." Sarah's posture shifted instantly, a familiar tension returning to her shoulders. She'd seen this before. Developers targeting vulnerable properties, pushing out the homeless to build luxury condos. It was exactly how Blake operated, though he didn't know she knew this. "I'll handle it," Sarah said, standing up. She pulled out her phone, the latest iPhone, a gift from Blake, and made a quick call to her new connections in the city council. Blake, who had decided to surprise Sarah at the shelter, arrived just in time to witness her expertly negotiating with the developers. He hung back, watching as she systematically dismantled their arguments and presented alternative solutions that would benefit both parties. "That was impressive," he said later, as they rode back to the penthouse in his car. "Where did you learn to negotiate like that?" Sarah tensed slightly before responding. "Life on the streets teaches you more about negotiation than any business school." That evening, Blake cancelled his usual dinner meeting to eat with Sarah in the penthouse. The chef had prepared coq au vin, and the city lights sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Tell me about your life," Blake said, surprising himself with his genuine interest. "Before the shelter, I mean." Sarah took a careful sip of wine, buying time. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. How does someone like you end up?" He trailed off, realizing how condescending he sounded. "Someone like me?" Sarah's voice carried a sharp edge. "You mean educated? Articulate? Capave?" Blake shifted uncomfortably. "That's not what I meant." "No." Sarah set down her fork. "Did you know that 40% of homeless women are victims of corporate downsizing? That many had careers, families, lives that looked just like yours before something went wrong?" The statistics hit too close to home. Blake thought about the companies he'd dismantled, the lives he'd dismissed as collateral damage in his pursuit of profit. "I had everything once," Sarah continued, carefully measuring her words. "A career I loved, a future I believed in. Then one day, someone decided that quarterly profits mattered more than people's lives." Blake felt a strange unease. "Which company? Does it matter?" Sarah stood up and walked to the window. "They're all the same in the end. Men in expensive suits, making decisions that destroy thousands of lives while sipping champagne in penthouses, just like this one." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations. Blake found himself questioning things he'd never considered before. The faces of employees from companies he'd acquired flashed through his mind. Had they ended up like Maria, like Jerome? "I could help," he offered finally. set up a foundation, create job training programs. Sarah turned to face him, her expression complex. Why? Because of guilt? Or because it would make a good PR story for your next hostile takeover? That's not fair, Blake protested, but the words felt hollow even to him. Isn't it? Sarah's voice softened. You know what I've learned, Blake? The difference between the people in that shelter and the people in your boardroom isn't ability, intelligence, or even luck. It's opportunity and empathy. Some people get second chances. Others get crushed by a system that sees them as nothing but numbers on a spreadsheet. Blake stood up, moved to stand beside her at the window. For the first time, he looked at the city below and saw more than just real estate values and investment opportunities. He saw people, thousands of stories, lives, and possibilities he'd never considered. Teach me, he said quietly. Sarah turned to him, surprise flickering across her face. For a moment, her carefully constructed walls seemed to waver. She hadn't expected this vulnerability from him, and it complicated her plans in ways she hadn't anticipated. Okay, she replied, though they both knew this simple agreement carried weight far beyond its surface meaning. In her private moments, Sarah meticulously reviewed the documents hidden in an encrypted folder on her laptop. The screen displayed familiar financial statements. The last quarterly report of Morrison Technologies before Blake Thompson's hostile takeover had torn it apart. Her company, her life's work. The logo at the top of the page still made her chest tight. A stylized M she had helped design 15 years ago. When she'd founded the company, Sarah Matthews, the youngest female CEO in the tech sector, had been celebrated as a pioneer. Now that name was buried, along with the careers of 3,000 employees who'd lost their jobs when Blake's firm gutted the company. A knock at her door made her quickly close the laptop. Come in. Blake entered, looking unusually casual in a sweater, rather than his typical suit. I thought we could have lunch together. Sarah noticed the slight nervousness in his voice, a new development that both pleased and unsettled her. Her plan for revenge was clear: expose his fraudulent practices during their wedding, using evidence she'd gathered from her time as CEO. But Blake was proving to be more complex than the heartless corporate raider she'd studied. I have to prepare for the charity gala tonight, she replied, watching his face fall slightly. Right, the Children's Hospital fundraiser. He lingered in the doorway. You know, I never used to attend these events. Wrote checks, sure, but actually showing up seemed like a waste of time. And now I'm starting to understand why you spend so much time at the shelter. He ran a hand through his hair. A gesture she'd learned meant he was genuinely uncomfortable. The people there, they're not just statistics anymore. Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls waver. This wasn't part of the plan. Blake, showing signs of genuine change, of vulnerability. Later that evening, at the Metropolitan Museum's Grand Hall, Sarah commanded attention in a midnight blue gown. The city's elite buzzed with speculation about Blake Thompson's mysterious, who spoke 4 languages and could discuss everything from market derivatives to classical architecture. She's remarkable, Winston Chen, one of Blake's board members, commented as they watched Sarah charming a group of potential donors. Nothing like what we expected when you told us about your arrangement. Blake's jaw tightened at the reminder of the bet, something he'd been trying hard to forget. Sarah's full of surprises. Across the room, Sarah was in her element. This was her world once, before Blake's takeover had stripped everything away. She recognized many faces, former colleagues, business partners, competitors. None recognized her. Amazing what a change of hair color and 5 years could do. Yor is quite knowledgeable about corporate finance, Richard Morrison commented. Approaching Blake, Sarah froze mid-conversation, hearing her former board chairman's voice, almost as if she has done this before. Blake laughed, oblivious to Sarah's tension. She's a natural, indeed. Morrison studied Sarah thoughtfully. Reminds me of someone I used to know. Sarah excused herself gracefully, heart pounding. In the powder room, she gripped the marble counter, staring at her reflection. The woman who looked back was a perfect hybrid, part society bride, part strategic weapon. But which was the real mask? Blake found her on the terrace later, overlooking the city lights. "You were amazing tonight," he said, placing his jacket around her shoulders. The gesture was automatic, protective. "When had that started?" "Blake," she began, then hesitated. For the first time since starting this deception, she considered telling him the truth, not for his sake, but because the lie was becoming harder to maintain. Not because of fear of discovery, but because of something far more dangerous. Genuine feeling. "What is it?" She turned to face him. "Do you ever regret any of it? The companies you've destroyed, the lives you've affected?" "I used to think it was just business," he said slowly. "Numbers on a page. But lately," he trailed off, looking troubled. Lately, I'm not sure about anything." He met her eyes. "Except you." Sarah felt sick. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Blake Thompson was supposed to be a monster. Cold, calculating, ruthless. Not this man who brought her coffee in the mornings, and remembered how she liked her tea, and listened when she talked about the shelter's needs. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "people aren't who we think they are." "Is this about the bet?" Blake asked suddenly. "Because that doesn't matter anymore. What I feel for you, don't." Sarah cut him off sharply. "Don't say something you can't take back." She walked away, leaving him confused on the terrace. In her room, she opened her laptop again, staring at the evidence she'd gathered. The proof of Blake's fraudulent practices during the Morrison Technologies takeover was clear, damaging, enough to ruin him completely. Yet for the first time, her finger hesitated over the send button that would set everything in motion. 2 weeks before the wedding, the tension in the penthouse became palpable. Sarah stood in the massive dressing room, surrounded by racks of designer wedding gowns, while her newly hired wedding planner chatted about flower arrangements and table settings. "Mr. Thompson's requested white orchids for all the centerpieces," the planner said, flipping through her tablet. "The guest list is at 500 now, including the governor and 3 senators. Sarah stared at her reflection in the three-way mirror. The woman looking back wore a $50,000 Oscar de la Renta gown, but all she could see was the Morrison Technologies boardroom 5 years ago, the day Blake's hostile takeover succeeded. She'd worn white that day too. Missed the belt, the seating arrangements. "I need a minute," Sarah said abruptly, stepping off the platform. She walked quickly to her room, locking the door behind her. Her burner phone, the one Blake didn't know about, had 3 missed calls from Maria at the shelter. Sarah had asked her to track down former Morrison employees, gathering statements about the takeover's impact on their lives. The evidence against Blake was mounting. In his office 20 floors below, Blake sat with his legal team, reviewing prenuptial agreements. But his mind kept wandering to Sarah's increasing withdrawal over the past week. "Mr. Thompson," his lawyer's voice broke through his thoughts, "about the asset protection clause." "Cancel the prenup," Blake said suddenly. "Sir, given the circumstances of your arrangement, that would be extremely unwise." Blake stood up, walking to the window. "Cancel it. All of it." Later that evening, Blake's closest associates gathered at their usual club, ostensibly for a pre-wedding celebration. The atmosphere was tense. "Have you lost your mind?" James demanded. "Canceling the prenup? This was supposed to be a bet, Blake, not a fairy tale." "You don't know her like I do," Blake defended. "No one knows her," Michael interjected. "Have you even run a background check?" She appeared out of nowhere. "And now you're ready to risk everything." Blake's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, "Meeting Maria at shelter. Don't wait up." At the shelter, Sarah sat in the small office with Maria, reviewing the statements they'd collected. 23 former employees, Maria said, sliding over a folder, all willing to testify about the fraud during the takeover. Plus, these documents showing how Blake's firm manipulated stock prices. Sarah opened the folder with trembling hands, and the board members, 3 agreed to come forward. Maria hesitated. Sarah, are you sure about this? The way you talk about him sometimes. He destroyed everything I built, Sarah snapped. 3,000 people lost their jobs. Families were ruined. People change. Maria said quietly, you of all people know that. Sarah thought about Blake's cancelled meetings to help at shelter fundraisers. The job training program he'd secretly started funding. The way he'd stopped talking about hostile takeovers and started asking about community impact. It's too late, Sarah whispered. Everything's in motion. Back at the penthouse, Blake found himself in Sarah's room, looking for a document she'd mentioned about the shelter's renovation plans. As he opened her laptop, an alert popped up. Backup complete. Morrison Technologies' final board meeting minutes. Blake froze. The name hit him like a physical blow. He clicked the file, and suddenly everything started falling into place. Sarah's financial knowledge, her perfect understanding of corporate operations, the familiar way she handled business situations. He was still sitting there when Sarah returned. Blake, she stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. What are you doing in here? Who are you really? His voice was quiet, dangerous. Or should I say, who were you? Sarah's face remained carefully neutral, but her hands clenched at her sides. You shouldn't be on my computer, Sarah Matthews. Blake turned the laptop screen toward her. CEO of Morrison Technologies, the company I acquired 5 years ago. He laughed bitterly. No wonder you seemed too good to be true. Blake, was any of it real? He stood up, anger and hurt warring in his expression. Or was this all just an elaborate revenge plot? Sarah lifted her chin, her own anger finally breaking through. Would you believe me if I said it was both? The silence between them crackled with unspoken accusations and betrayals. 5 years of pain and 3 months of growing feelings collided in one moment of terrible clarity. The wedding, Blake said finally. You were planning something. Am planning something, Sarah corrected. Nothing's changed. But they both knew that wasn't true. Everything had changed, and neither of them knew how to stop what was coming. Sarah jerked awake in her silk sheets, heart racing. In her dream, she'd been back in the Morrison Technologies boardroom, but this time Blake had been beside her, not across the table. They'd been fighting together against unseen adversaries, until she'd turned to find him gone, replaced by shadows of her former employees. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m., 20 hours until the wedding. She got up, walking to the window wall of her bedroom. The city sparkled below, reminding her of late nights at Morrison, working on projects that would have revolutionized affordable housing technology. Projects that died when Blake's firm stripped the company for parts. Her phone lit up with a text from Maria. Final statements collected, video testimonials ready, press contacts confirmed for tomorrow. Sarah's hand shook as she typed back, proceed as planned. Across the penthouse, Blake sat in his study, a glass of scotch untouched before him. His bachelor party raged on at the club downtown, but he couldn't bring himself to celebrate. Instead, he was reviewing old files about the Morrison Technologies acquisition. He'd missed it before. The brilliance of Sarah's leadership. The company hadn't been failing. It had been on the verge of a breakthrough. His firm's analysts had completely misread the R&D investments as wasteful spending, or had they? Blake pulled up more documents, seeing patterns he'd overlooked 5 years ago. Sir, his security chief appeared in the doorway. We've detected unusual activity around tomorrow's wedding. Multiple press inquiries about Morrison Technologies, and several former employees have been added to the guest list. Blake nodded slowly. Let them come. Sir, given the situation with Miss Sarah, I said, let them come. Blake stood up, walk into his own window, and get me everything you can find about the original takeover. Every document, every email, every decision. Now, it's the middle of the night before your wedding. Exactly. Blake turned, his expression hard. I need to know if I destroyed a good company because of bad information, or if I was manipulated into it. Either way, I owe someone the truth. At the club downtown, Blake's friends were growing increasingly worried about his absence. "He's not thinking straight," James slurred, waving his drink. "That woman's got him completely twisted around." Michael nodded. "The Blake we know would never cancel a prenup, never skip his own bachelor party." "Maybe that's the point," David said quietly. "Maybe the Blake we know needed to change." Back at the penthouse, Sarah slipped into the study after Blake left, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. His computer was still on, showing the Morrison Technologies files. She sat in his chair, scrolling through his recent searches. Morrison Technologies, innovation pipeline, Sarah Matthews leadership style, corporate takeover reform. She pulled out her own phone, looking at the evidence she'd gathered. The story she'd planned to tell tomorrow was simple. Blake Thompson, CORPORATE raider, had deliberately destroyed a promising company for profit, ruining thousands of lives in the process. But now she saw his own investigation, his late-night searches, trying to understand what really happened. It complicated everything. Dawn broke over the city, finding both of them in their separate spaces, wrestling with decisions that would affect not just their lives, but the lives of everyone involved in tomorrow's spectacle. Sarah finally called Maria. "I need to know something," she said without preamble. "The board members who agreed to testify, who approached who first?" "They contacted us," Maria replied. "Said they had information about the takeover that never came to light. Something about internal manipulation of the board." Sarah felt her world tilt slightly. "Send me everything, now." In his bedroom, Blake was reaching a similar revelation through his own investigation. The takeover hadn't been his idea originally. Someone on Morrison's board had approached his firm, provided the analysis that made the company look ripe for acquisition. "Sir," his security chief appeared again. "You asked about board member communications from 5 years ago. We found something interesting in the encrypted archives." Blake took the tablet, reading quickly. His face went through a series of emotions: shock, anger, understanding. "Call the car," he said finally. "I need to see Sarah." But when he reached her room, he found only a note on her perfectly made bed. "Some truths are bigger than us. See you at the wedding." Blake stood there, holding the note, realizing that tomorrow's ceremony had become something far more significant than either of them had initially planned. It wasn't just about their personal drama anymore. It was about exposing a truth that both of them were just beginning to understand. He took out his phone and made a call. "Change of plans for tomorrow. I need you to prepare a different kind of presentation." The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom glittered with old money and new power. 500 of New York's elite mingled under crystal chandeliers, their collective net worth rivaling some small nations. The wedding ceremony had gone smoothly, almost too smoothly, with Sarah and Blake exchanging vows, with an intensity that left guests whispering about the palpable tension between them. Sarah stood at the entrance to the reception, her white Vera Wang gown drawing admiring glances. She watched Blake work in the room, noting how he kept glancing at his phone, checking the time. He knew something was coming. The question was, did he know what? "Ladies and gentlemen," the wedding planner announced, "please take your seats for the couple's first speech." Sarah felt Maria's presence before she saw her, slipping in through a side door with a small group of people, former Morrison Technologies employees, each carrying tablets loaded with evidence of corporate manipulation. Blake caught Sarah's eye across the room. For a moment, everything else faded away. He gave her a slight nod, almost imperceptible. She found herself returning it, though she didn't know why. As tradition dictates, the MC began. "The bride will say a few words about her journey to this happy day." Sarah approached the microphone, her heart pounding. The faces before her were a mix of genuine well-wishers and sharks in evening wear. She recognized at least 3 people who had sat on Morrison's board the day of the takeover. 5 years ago, she began, her voice steady, "I stood in a different room, facing a different crowd. I was CEO of Morrison Technologies then." A murmur rippled through the audience. Blake remained perfectly still at his table, his expression unreadable. Most of you know Blake Thompson as a brilliant investor, a corporate raider who transformed struggling companies into profit machines. Sarah paused, scanning the crowd. What you don't know is the real cost of those transformations. The lives destroyed, the innovations lost, the communities devastated. The murmur grew louder. Camera phones rose throughout the room. I lost everything when Blake's firm took over Morrison Technologies. 3,000 people lost their jobs. A revolutionary affordable housing technology program died in development. And she faltered for the first time. I disappeared. Sarah, Blake stood up, but she held up her hand. No, Blake, let me finish, because this isn't just about us anymore. She nodded to Maria, who began distributing tablets to key media figures in the room. These documents show systematic fraud and manipulation during the Morrison takeover. But here's the twist. The fraud didn't originate with Blake Thompson. Now, it was Blake's turn to look surprised. He hadn't expected this turn. The manipulation came from within Morrison's own board. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. 3 board members conspired to make the company appear vulnerable, fabricating reports and hiding breakthrough innovations. They stood to make millions from the takeover through hidden stock options. The room erupted in chaos. Several guests tried to leave but found the doors discreetly guarded by security. Sarah noticed Blake's slight smile. He'd anticipated this. But that's not the end of the story, Sarah said, raising her voice above the commotion, because something unexpected happened. Blake Thompson, the corporate raider everyone loves to hate, changed. I came here planning revenge, planning to expose him as a monster who destroyed my company. Instead, I found someone who's been wrestling with his own demons, questioning his own choices. She turned to face Blake directly now. You didn't know about the board's manipulation, did you? Just like I didn't know until recently. We were both played. Blake stood again, moving toward the microphone. The room fell silent. Hundreds of New York's most powerful people holding their breath to see how this unprecedented drama would unfold. No, he said finally, reaching her side. I didn't know, but I should have looked deeper. I was too focused on profits to see the innovation we were destroying. He turned to address the crowd. Which is why, effective immediately, I'm announcing the reformation of Morrison Technologies. Gasps filled the room. Sarah stared at him, genuinely shocked for the first time that day. With its original CEO reinstated, Blake continued, if she accept the position. He turned to Sarah, a challenge in his eyes. Unless, of course, you're still planning to destroy me. The room waited, cameras flashing, as Sarah faced the choice she never expected to have to make. The grand ballroom had transformed from a wedding reception into something resembling a corporate showdown. Guests who had come expecting champagne and cake found themselves witnesses to one of the biggest business scandals of the decade. Blake took control of the microphone, his CEO persona fully engaged. Security, please ensure that board members Richard Davidson, Thomas Wells, and Patricia Murray remain in the room. He nodded to his security team, who moved to block specific exits. We have some questions about certain stock transactions from 5 years ago. The 3 named board members reacted visibly. Davidson, a silver-haired man in his 60s, stood up abruptly. This is outrageous. You can't hold us here. Actually, Blake's lawyer stepped forward, holding up his tablet. The SEC agents in the room might disagree. 2 men in dark suits emerged from the crowd, badges appearing. Sarah watched the scene unfold, her mind racing. This wasn't how she'd planned this day. Her evidence was meant to expose Blake, not vindicate him. Yet here he was, turning the tables on the real perpetrators. If I may, she stepped forward, her wedding dress rustling as she moved to stand beside Blake. I have documentation showing exactly how the board manipulated our financial reports. She gestured to Maria, who began displaying specific documents on the ballroom's large screens. The evidence was damning. Email trails showed coordinated efforts to hide Morrison's true value. particularly its breakthrough in sustainable housing technology. Financial reports had been deliberately misinterpreted, making R&D investments look like losses. Patricia Murray, the youngest of the accused board members, cracked first. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she blurted out. "The plan was just to make a quick profit on the stock options. We didn't know they'd dismantled the entire company." The room erupted again. Journalists who had been invited to cover a high society wedding were now frantically calling their editors. Wall Street players in attendance were already on their phones, adjusting positions based on the unfolding scandal. Blake James Peterson stood up, his face red with anger. "What about our bet? This whole marriage was a sham, a bet you made while drunk." Sarah turned to Blake, her expression sharp, even though she'd known about the bet. Hearing it proclaimed publicly stung in an unexpected way. Blake faced his friend directly. The bet was real, but something more real happened along the way. He turned to Sarah. "I fell in love with the woman I was supposed to destroy, and she showed me everything wrong with the way I did business." "This is all very touching," Davidson interrupted, his lawyer now at his side, "but you have no proof of any wrongdoing. These documents could easily be fabricated." "That's where you're wrong," a new voice spoke up. The crowd parted as Richard Morrison himself, Sarah's former board chairman, walked forward. "I've been gathering evidence against you 3-4 years, working with both Blake and Sarah, though neither knew about the other." This revelation stunned both bride and groom. They turned to Morrison, who smiled sadly. "I suspected the manipulation when it happened, but couldn't prove it in time," Morrison explained. "I've spent 5 years tracking every transaction, every hidden account. When I heard about this wedding, I knew it would bring everyone together." Sarah's mind raced back to Morrison's strange comments at the charity gala, his knowing looks. "You orchestrated this." "I merely created an opportunity," Morrison replied. "Everything that happened between you two was real." Sometimes karma has a sense of humor. The SEC agents were now formally detaining Davidson, Wells, and Murray. The other guests watched in shocked fascination as the three were led away, their protests drowned out by the buzz of conversation and furiously typing journalists. Blake turned to his assembled friends and business associates. "Those of you who knew my old methods, who celebrated every hostile takeover, every company I stripped for parts, take a good look. This is the real cost of treating businesses like games and people like numbers." Several prominent investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded slowly, perhaps seeing their own practices in a new light. Sarah watched Blake, seeing him truly for the first time. The man she'd planned to destroy had destroyed himself, or rather, had destroyed the person he used to be. The question remaining was, what would rise from these ashes? The wedding reception had devolved into something between a press conference and a shareholder meeting. The shelter residents Sarah had invited, initially meant to testify against Blake, now stood as witnesses to a different kind of corporate transformation. Maria stepped forward, commanding attention despite her simple dress among the designer gowns. "I'd like to share something about Sarah, or Ms. Matthews, as I now know her." She looked directly at the assembled business elite. "While living in our shelter, she never stopped working to help others. She used her business knowledge to help residents create resumes, start small businesses, navigate financial systems that were designed to exclude them." Other shelter residents began standing up throughout the ballroom. Jerome, the veteran, spoke next. "She taught me how to start an online business. I now employ for other veterans from the shelter." Blake watched these testimonials with growing understanding. Sarah hadn't just been hiding at the shelter. She'd been building a grassroots economic revival program. Sarah took the microphone again. "This is what Morrison Technologies was really about. Not just creating affordable housing, but creating economic opportunities. Before the takeover, we were developing a comprehensive urban renewal program that would have combined housing technology with business incubation." Blake stepped forward. "And that's exactly what the new Morrison Technologies will do." He turned to address the crowd directly. For years, I've measured success in profit margins and stock prices. Sarah showed me there's another way to build wealth, by lifting entire communities. The room's atmosphere began to shift. Where there had been scandal and shock, now there was something else. Possibility. Investors who had come to celebrate a society wedding were now pulling out phones, running numbers, seeing opportunities they'd overlooked. "I'm pledging $50 million in initial funding," announced Winston Chen, rising from his seat. "My firm has been looking for serious community development investments. The Davidson Group will match that," called another voice. Others followed, the momentum building. Sarah watched in amazement as the very people who had once celebrated Morrison's downfall now competed to be part of its resurrection. She felt Blake's hand slip into hers, warm and steady. "Still want to destroy me," he whispered. "I think you did that yourself," she replied softly. "The question is, who are you now?" Before he could answer, James Peterson stormed up to them, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "This is insane, Blake. You're throwing away everything we built. Our whole investment strategy was wrong." Blake cut him off. "We made billions by destroying value, not creating it. Look around, James. Look at what happens when you invest in people instead of just profits." Maria approached with her tablet, showing projected returns on community development projects. "Your old model was about extraction," she explained to the gathered investors. "This is about growth. When you lift a community, you create new markets, new opportunities, new wealth." The business language seemed to reach them in a way pure altruism couldn't. Phones came out again, notes were taken, connections were made. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake addressed the room, "this wedding reception is now officially a founding meeting. Morrison Technologies 2.0 begins today. And yes," he smiled at Sarah, "the original CEO is back in charge." Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time that day. "On one condition," she said, turning to face him, "we do this together. Not as a corporate raider and his trophy wife, but as equal partners, both in business and in life." The room fell silent, waiting. This wasn't the revenge story they'd expected, nor the society wedding they'd come to see. It was something entirely new. Blake looked at Sarah, really looked at her, not as the homeless woman he'd arrogantly tried to transform, not as the CEO he'd unknowingly destroyed, but as the person who had transformed him instead. "Partners," he agreed, extending his hand formally. Sarah took it, sealing both a business deal and something more personal. The applause that followed wasn't for the wedding anymore. It was for the birth of something unprecedented in corporate America. As the evening continued, plans were made, deals were struck, and a new kind of business model began to take shape. The shelter residents moved among the business elite as equals, their practical experience with community needs proving invaluable in discussions about implementation. The wedding cake sat forgotten in the corner, but something sweeter was being served. Redemption, transformation, and the possibility that even in the cutthroat world of high finance, change was possible. Just as the new Morrison Technologies partnership was being celebrated, the ballroom doors burst open. Marcus Chen, former Chief Technology Officer of Morrison Technologies, strode in with a thick folder under his arm. The room quieted immediately. "Before everyone gets too comfortable with this beautiful redemption story," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the room, "there's something else you need to know." He looked directly at Sarah and Blake. "You're both right, and you're both wrong." Security moved to intercept him, but Blake held up his hand. "Let him speak." Marcus opened his folder, distributing documents to key people in the room. 5 years ago, when Morrison Technologies fell, we all thought we knew who the villains were. Blake Thompson, the corporate raider, the corrupt board members. But the real story is more complicated. Sarah stepped forward, recognition dawning on her face. "Marcus, we thought you'd moved to Singapore after the takeover." "I did. And I've spent 5 years tracking every document, every transaction, every player in this game. He activated the ballroom's presentation screen. Sarah, you weren't just a victim. And Blake, you weren't just a predator. You were both pawns in a larger game. The screen displayed a complex web of transactions and shell companies. At its center was a name that made both Sarah and Blake freeze. Global Innovation Partners. My own company, Blake whispered. Not exactly, Marcus continued. Global Innovation Partners was infiltrated years ago by a consortium of tech companies afraid of Morrison's innovations. They planted the board members who corrupted the company from within. They fed Blake's firm the manipulated data. And Sarah, he turned to her, they made sure you'd lose everything. Because your vision of accessible technology threatened their profit models. The room erupted in murmurs as Marcus continued unveiling evidence. Documents showed how Sarah's innovative housing technology would have disrupted multiple industries. Blake's firm had been manipulated into becoming the weapon, but they weren't the architects. The question is, Marcus concluded, what are you going to do about it now? Blake and Sarah exchanged looks. The revenge plot, the redemption story, everything had just shifted again. We rebuild, Sarah said firmly, but this time we do it right. No hidden agendas, no secret plots. She turned to Blake, complete transparency. Blake nodded, then addressed the room. Morrison Technologies 2.0 isn't just about community development anymore. It's about changing how business itself works. Complete transparency in all transactions. Open source technology, development, community profit sharing. The business elite in the room shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't just corporate rehabilitation, it was revolution. Those who want to join us, stay, Sarah announced. Those who don't, there's the door. But know this, the old way of doing business ends today. To everyone's surprise, most stayed. Even James Peterson, Blake's most vocal critic, remained in his seat, looking thoughtful. One last thing, Marcus said, pulling out a final document. Sarah, remember that housing technology you were developing? I didn't just track the money these past 5 years. I kept working on the project. It's ready. Sarah took the tablet he offered, tears forming as she scrolled through the completed designs. This could change everything. It will, Blake said softly. Then, louder to the room, ladies and gentlemen, what started as a cruel bet and a revenge plot has become something else entirely. This isn't just a merger of 2 people or 2 companies. It's a complete reimagining of what business can be. He turned to Sarah, taking her hands in his. I fell in love with you twice. Once when I thought you were a homeless woman with extraordinary dignity, and again when I discovered you were the brilliant CEO I'd unknowingly destroyed. Now I'm falling in love a 3rd time with the partner who's going to help me build something entirely new. Sarah looked at him, seeing past all the layers of deception and transformation to the truth that had somehow emerged from their elaborate game. Partners in all things. In all things, he confirmed. The wedding celebration transformed into a different kind of party, one celebrating not just the union of 2 people, but the birth of a new way of doing business. As contracts were drawn up and plans were made, the cake was finally cut, sweet with a taste of unexpected victory. Marcus watched from the side, smiling slightly. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, but creation. And sometimes love stories happen in the most unlikely boardrooms. The story that began with a cruel bet and a revenge plot ended with something far more powerful: hope. Hope that even in the world of high finance, change is possible. Hope that love can grow in the strangest circumstances. And hope that sometimes the happy ending isn't what you planned, but what you never dared to imagine.